The dust of the training yard tasted like grit and regret. It clung to the back of Specialist Alara Vance's throat, a constant, gritty reminder of where she was, a forgotten corner of a forward operating base where the heat was as oppressive as the testosterone. She stood in the loose formation, a ghost in digital camouflage, her small frame and quiet demeanor making her all but invisible. That was the goal. To be invisible, to serve out this last tour as an administrative clerk, to file the paperwork of war instead of being its instrument, and then to finally, mercifully, disappear into the civilian world she no longer understood. But invisibility was a luxury the yard's reigning tyrant, Sergeant Major Rex Thorne, refused to grant. He moved through the ranks of sweating soldiers like a shark through a school of fish, his barrel chest puffed out, his jaw perpetually clenched around a cut of smokeless tobacco and smug superiority. His eyes, small and hard, scanned the formation and, as they had every day for the past 3 weeks, they landed on Vance. A slow, contemptuous smirk spread across his face. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice a gravelly assault on the quiet morning. "Look what we have here! Specialist Vance gracing us with her presence. You lost, little lady? The paper pusher's air-conditioned palace is that way." A few of his sycophants, a clutch of beefy corporals who orbited him like moons, chuckled on cue. Vance's eyes remained fixed on the cracked concrete slab in front of her. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She just stood, her posture a perfect parade rest, her expression a blank slate. This was the game. His provocation, her silence. He thrived on reaction, and she refused to give him the satisfaction. Her silence, however, was a different kind of provocation. It was a wall he couldn't seem to breach, and it infuriated him. "I'm talking to you, Specialist," he growled, stepping closer until he blotted out the sun. The smell of cheap coffee and arrogance washed over her. "This here is the training yard. For real soldiers. You sure you're in the right place? Don't want you to break a nail before you have to stamp your TPS reports." Vance finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes, a calm, steady gray, met his. "I am where I was ordered to be, Sergeant Major." Her voice was low, even, betraying no hint of the storm she kept carefully locked away inside. It was the voice of a clerk, clipped and professional. It was precisely the wrong thing to say. To Thorne, her measured respect sounded like insolence, her calm like a challenge. He saw her as a product of a new, softer army, a checkbox on a diversity report that had invaded his world of grit and glory. He believed women had a place in the service, just not here, not in the dirt, not where the real work was done. His prejudice was a dull, heavy instrument, and he wielded it with clumsy force. "Ordered to be," he mimicked in a high-pitched voice. "See, that's the problem. You new types just follow orders. You don't have the fire. The grit. You don't understand the warrior ethos." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her boots. "But that's okay. Uncle Rex is gonna give you an education today. We're having a little morale event, a friendly competition. Show these boys what a real warrior looks like." His eyes swept the crowd, a cruel glint in them. "And you, Specialist, are going to participate. It's an order." The words hung in the hot air, a direct challenge she could not refuse. The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. They knew what this was. It wasn't a morale event, it was a public humiliation in the making. Vance felt the weight of their stares, a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. Deep within her, behind the carefully constructed walls of the quiet clerk, a long dormant part of her stirred. A part that had been forged in places darker than this sun-bleached yard, a part that knew the true meaning of the word warrior, and it was tired of being silent. For a fleeting moment, a different woman looked out from Alara Vance's eyes, a woman Thorne would have been wise to fear. But all he saw was a small, quiet specialist who was about to be taught a lesson. The friendly competition began, as they always did, at the rifle range. It was Thorne's domain, a place where he could posture and pontificate about breathing control and trigger squeeze. He set up an advanced course, with pop-up targets at varying, unknown distances, designed to test instinct and skill, not just basic marksmanship. It was a course for seasoned infantrymen. His boys went first, their shots echoing across the yard, their performance a mixture of competence and bravado. They slapped each other on the back, their laughter loud and forced. Then, it was Vance's turn. Thorne handed her a standard issue M4, his smirk oozing condescension. "All right, sweetheart. Try not to shoot your own foot. Point this end toward the bad guys." The rifle felt like an old friend in her hands, a familiar weight that settled into the grooves of her memory. She checked the action, slapped the magazine home, and brought the stock to her shoulder in a single, fluid motion that was so practiced, so economical, it went almost unnoticed. She didn't adopt the rigid, textbook stance most of the others had. Instead, she settled into a lower, more aggressive combat stance, her body relaxed but poised, a coiled spring of potential energy. Thorne watched, a flicker of something, annoyance? Surprise, crossing his face before he masked it with another sneer. The targets began to pop up. A steel plate at 200 meters. Ping. A silhouette at 350. Ping. Two hostiles appearing and disappearing behind cover at 150. Ping. Ping. Her movements were minimal. Her breathing was a steady, almost silent rhythm. There was no wasted motion, no theatrical flair. It was simply a matter of physics and anatomy, of aligning the tool with the target and executing the task with flawless precision. Each report of the rifle was followed instantly by the satisfying, metallic sound of a hit. She cleared the course in record time, a perfect score. Silence descended on the range. The smug laughter of Thorne's cronies had died in their throats. They stared, first at the smoking targets, then at the small woman who stood calmly at the firing line, ejecting the magazine and clearing the weapon with practiced ease. Thorne's face had turned a blotchy red. He snatched the rifle from her. "Lucky," he grunted, the word a weak defense against the undeniable evidence of her skill. "Beginner's luck. Any clerk can get lucky behind a scope. Let's see how you do when things get a little more personal." He herded them toward the combatives' pit, a large, matted area designed for hand-to-hand combat training. The air grew thicker, heavier with the promise of violence. This was Thorne's true arena, where size and brute force were king. He fancied himself a brawler, a practitioner of what he called real-world fighting, which mostly consisted of clumsy haymakers and bullish tackles. "All right," he announced, gesturing to the mat. "Time for a little demonstration. Corporal Rourke, get in there." Corporal Bull Rourke, Thorne's largest and most brutish disciple, lumbered onto the mat. He was a mountain of a man, with a shaved head and a neck as thick as a tree trunk. He grinned, cracking his knuckles with theatrical menace. Thorne turned to Vance. "Your turn, specialist. Rourke is going to demonstrate a few basic takedowns. You're the training dummy." Lieutenant Harris, a young officer who had been watching the proceedings with a growing sense of unease, stepped forward. "Sergeant Major, perhaps this isn't appropriate. Specialist Vance isn't in an infantry MOS. This level of physical dash, this level of physical what, Lieutenant?" Thorne cut him off, his voice dangerously low. "Training? Readiness? You think the enemy is going to check her MOS before they try to grab her? Get back in line, sir. This is my yard." Harris flushed but reluctantly stepped back, his jaw tight with frustration. He knew he was outranked and outmaneuvered. Vance stepped onto the mat, her face still a mask of calm. She looked at the giant approaching her, a man who outweighed her by 100 pounds of solid muscle. "Just try to defend, specialist," Rourke grunted, his grin widening. "Don't want to break you." He lunged, a clumsy, telegraphed move. Vance didn't try to counter. She didn't try to win. She simply moved with him, deflecting his momentum, using minimal effort to shift his center of gravity just enough so that his grab missed. He stumbled past her. He tried again, a bear hug attempt. She sidestepped, her hand lightly checking his shoulder, guiding him off balance. For 5 minutes the bizarre dance continued. Rourke, growing increasingly frustrated and red-faced, would attack, and Vance would simply not be there. She flowed around him like water, never once launching an offensive move, never once trying to hurt him. She was a ghost, an untouchable target, and it was making him look foolish. Thorn finally called a halt, his face thunderous. "See?" he yelled to the assembled soldiers. "This is what I'm talking about. Passive. Defensive. No killer instinct. That's not how you survive a fight. You attack. You dominate." He glared at Vance, who stood breathing easily in the center of the mat. He saw her elegant evasions not as skill, but as weakness. He saw her control not as discipline, but as fear. In his mind, she had failed his test utterly. The final act of the charade was a mock scenario Thorn called Last Stand. He led them to the Mout village, a collection of concrete block buildings meant to simulate an urban environment. "The scenario is simple," Thorn announced, his voice dripping with malice. "We have a high-value asset inside this building." He pointed to a small, one-room structure. "A team of 5 hostiles is closing in to capture it. 1 defender has to hold them off. Specialist Vance, you're the defender." A murmur went through the crowd. 5 against 1. It wasn't a training scenario. It was a beatdown. Lieutenant Harris stepped forward again, his voice firm. "Sergeant Major Thorn, this is no longer a training exercise. This is hazing. I am ordering you to stand down." Thorn spun on him, his face contorted with rage. "You are ordering me? Lieutenant, you are a guest in my house. You will stand down, or I will have you written up for insubordination so fast your head will spin. Is that clear?" The threat hung in the air. Harris, knowing the political battle he would lose, gave Vance a look of profound apology and stepped back, defeated. The 5 hostiles were chosen. Bo Rourke, of course, and 4 others from Thorn's inner circle. They were all large, aggressive, and currently wearing identical, predatory grins. They were handed blue training rifles. Vance was handed one as well. "Rules are simple," Thorn barked. "Hostiles, you secure the objective. Vance, you stop them. Full contact is authorized. Go." The 5 men fanned out, their movements sloppy but confident. They treated it like a game, laughing and joking as they surrounded the small building. Vance slipped inside, the single door her only entrance and exit. She didn't check the corners. She didn't seek cover. She simply stood in the center of the small, dusty room and waited. The door burst open. Rourke filled the frame, flanked by 2 others. 2 more were circling around to the single window. They had her cornered. They advanced into the room, spreading out, their training rifles leveled at her. "Nowhere to run, little lady," Rourke sneered. He took another step, then with a sudden, swift movement, he lunged and ripped the M4 from her hands, tossing it into a corner. "No pew-pew stick for you, sweetheart," he said, the words echoing Thorn's earlier insult. "Now what?" The 5 of them formed a semicircle, closing in, their large bodies blocking the light from the door. They were taking their time, savoring the moment. To them, she was utterly helpless. A disarmed woman, small and alone, surrounded by 5 men ready to prove their dominance. It was in this suffocating, hopeless moment that Alara Vance made a choice. For weeks, she had endured. For years, she had hidden. She had buried a part of herself so deep she sometimes wondered if it was still there. She had accepted the quiet life, the administrative duties, the condescending remarks of men like Thorn, all as a penance, a way to find peace. But she realized now, in this small, dusty room, that peace was not found in surrender. It was found in truth. She thought of her mentor, a man whose face was a collection of scars and whose name was redacted from every official record. He had taught her that the body was a weapon system, and her mind was the targeting computer. Never start a fight, he had told her, his voice a quiet rasp. But always, always finish it. A profound calm settled over her. The frantic beating of her heart slowed to a steady, powerful rhythm. The noise of the world faded into a dull hum. Her focus narrowed to the 5 threats in front of her, their movements, their breathing, their intentions. The clerk was gone. The soldier who stood there now was someone else entirely. Something else. The first to fall was Rourke. He was the leader, the most confident, and therefore the most vulnerable. He stepped forward, reaching for her arm, his face a mask of smug triumph. This was the moment the universe pivoted. The action unfolded in a space between heartbeats, a ballet of brutal efficiency that defied belief. As his hand reached for her, she didn't retreat. She exploded forward, flowing into his space. The onlookers saw a blur. A slow-motion breakdown would have revealed the impossible physics of it. Her left hand shot up, not to block his arm, but to guide it, parrying it slightly outward. Simultaneously, her body rotated, channeling the full force of her momentum into a single, devastating strike. The heel of her right palm connected with the underside of Rourke's chin, the impact snapping his head back with an audible crack of teeth. His eyes rolled up into his head, his brain momentarily short-circuiting from the concussive force. But she wasn't done. As his 240-pound frame began its descent into unconsciousness, her right leg swept behind his, kicking his feet out from under him. He fell like a felled oak, his body hitting the concrete floor with a sickening thud that echoed in the stunned silence. Time elapsed, 4 seconds. The two men on either side of Rourke reacted a half-second too late, their brains still struggling to process what they had just witnessed. They moved in from the flanks, a clumsy, rage-fueled pincer attack. This was a fatal error. They had funneled themselves. Vance moved between them, a phantom of speed and precision. The man on her left threw a wild haymaker. She slipped under it, her body so close to his she could feel the heat rolling off him. Her left elbow, a hardened point of bone, pistoned upward, connecting with the temporal bone just beside his eye. The strike was not meant to knock him out, but to scramble his equilibrium. He staggered back, a dazed look on his face, his world tilting violently. The man on her right tried to grab her from behind. She felt his hands grasp her shoulder and spun into the grab, not away from it. The move was counterintuitive and brilliant. Her rotation used his own grip as a fulcrum. As she spun, she drove her right elbow backward, directly into the brachial plexus nerve cluster in his armpit. A jolt like 1,000 volts of electricity shot down his arm. It went instantly numb and useless, hanging limply at his side. He screamed, a sound of pure shock and pain. She completed her spin, facing him now. A precise, open-handed strike to the side of his neck found the carotid sinus. His blood pressure plummeted. His eyes glazed over, and he slumped to the floor, his body going boneless. Time elapsed, 12 seconds since Rourke fell. The fourth man, positioned near the window, was frozen. Not with indecision, but with primal fear. He had seen 3 of his friends, 3 large, capable men, dismantled in the time it takes to draw a breath. He saw the woman in the center of the room, not as a victim, but as a predator. His training screamed at him to act, but his survival instinct screamed louder to run. He chose a fatal middle ground, hesitation. That single second of pause was all the invitation Vance needed. She crossed the 10 feet of open space between them in 3 silent, fluid steps. He saw her coming and tried to raise his arms in a defensive posture. It was futile. Her hands moved in a dizzying, hypnotic pattern. A strike to his wrist broke his guard. A second strike targeted the radial nerve in his forearm, causing his hand to clench into an involuntary, painful fist. A third, a brutal ridge hand, slammed into the side of his knee, hyperextending the joint with a soft, sickening pop. He collapsed, his leg buckling beneath him, a howl of agony torn from his throat. The final man, the one who had been guarding the door, was now backing away slowly, his hands held up in a gesture of surrender. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended any training scenario. He was looking at something that did not belong in his world, a force of nature in human form. Vance advanced on him, her steps measured and deliberate. Her face was serene, her gray eyes holding his, devoid of anger or malice. There was only focus. A terrible, absolute focus. He stumbled backward out of the doorway, into the harsh sunlight of the yard, turning to flee. She was on him in an instant. Her arm wrapped around his neck from behind, her other hand cupping the back of his head. It was not a sloppy barroom chokehold. It was a perfectly applied vascular neck restraint, a technique of terrifying efficiency. She applied pressure to the carotid arteries, cutting off the flow of blood to his brain. He struggled for a few frantic seconds, his hands clawing at the arm that was the instrument of his defeat. Then, his body went limp. She held him for a moment longer, then gently lowered his unconscious form to the dusty ground. 83 seconds. From the moment Rourke had reached for her to the moment the last man fell, a mere minute and 23 seconds had passed. Elara Vance stood in the center of the carnage she had wrought, a still point in a world she had just turned upside down. Her breathing was even, her uniform barely disturbed. She was not even winded. Around the Mout village, the assembled soldiers stood as if turned to stone. Jaws hung open. Eyes were wide with disbelief. They had come expecting to see a woman humiliated. Instead, they had witnessed a masterclass in controlled, devastating violence. Sergeant Major Thorne stood beside Lieutenant Harris, his face a grotesque mask of shock and disbelief. The smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed horror. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, unhealthy pallor. He was looking at Vance, but he wasn't seeing the quiet clerk anymore. He was seeing a monster, a ghost, a lethal entity that had just effortlessly dispatched 5 of his best men without breaking a sweat. The silence was finally broken by Lieutenant Harris, his voice a hoarse whisper filled with something akin to reverence. "My God!" he breathed. He was the first to move, walking slowly, cautiously toward the building, his eyes locked on Vance. He approached her as one might approach an unexploded bomb. "Specialist Vance," he said, his voice unsteady. Are you okay?" Vance turned her head, her calm gray eyes meeting his. The terrifying focus was gone, replaced by the quiet, weary demeanor of the clerk. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm fine, sir," she said, her voice as level as if she were discussing a supply requisition. The spell was broken. Medics were called, their shouts cutting through the stunned atmosphere. They rushed forward with stretchers, their faces grim as they began to assess the damage. The diagnoses came back in clipped, professional tones. Rourke, severe concussion, possible jaw fracture. The second man, suspected orbital fracture. The third, brachial plexus shock, temporary paralysis of the arm. The fourth, dislocated patella, torn ligaments. The fifth, temporary unconsciousness from asphyxiation. The injuries were clinical, precise, and brutally effective. They were disabling, not murderous. It was the work of a surgeon, not a brawler. The whispers started then, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Who was she? Where did she learn to fight like that? The mystery of the quiet clerk deepened into a legend. That afternoon, the official investigation began. Thorne, desperate to regain control, tried to paint Vance as an unhinged, dangerous soldier who had snapped and brutally assaulted his men without provocation. His blustering account, however, was filled with inconsistencies and reeked of self-preservation. Lieutenant Harris, emboldened by what he had witnessed, wrote a scathing and meticulously detailed report. He chronicled Thorne's relentless campaign of harassment, the unsafe nature of the unsanctioned competition, and Vance's remarkable restraint until she was physically cornered and disarmed. He described her actions not as an assault, but as a perfect, justified, and necessary application of defensive force. The reports landed on the desk of the base commander, Colonel Jennings, a man who had seen enough of war to value quiet competence over loud bravado. He read Thorne's report with a deepening frown, and Harris's with a raised eyebrow. Then, he pulled Specialist Elara Vance's personnel file. It was thin, mostly blacked out with the thick, ominous lines of redaction. Her MOS was listed as 42A, Human Resources Specialist. Her previous assignments were classified. But Jennings, a man who knew how to read the spaces between the lines, saw a small, almost invisible notation at the bottom of a page, a ghost of a stamp from a previous command. It read, JSOCSPTDTA. Joint Special Operations Command, Support Detachment Alpha. It was a designation so obscure, so secret, that most of the army didn't even know it existed. Jennings leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. It all made sense. She wasn't an admin clerk who happened to be good at fighting. She was one of the most highly trained and lethal operators on the planet, hiding in plain sight as an admin clerk. Her current assignment wasn't a career choice. It was a cool-down lap, a mandatory de-escalation after years operating in the darkest corners of the world. Thorne hadn't been hazing a clerk. He had been poking a sleeping grizzly bear with a sharp stick. The hammer came down swiftly. Sergeant Major Thorne was suspended from his duties, pending a command investigation into leadership malpractice, hazing, and creating a hostile command climate. His career was, for all intents and purposes, over. He was publicly disgraced, his authority stripped away not by a superior officer, but by the quiet competence of the very person he had tried so desperately to humiliate. Justice, in its own slow, grinding way, had been served. Elara Vance was summoned to the colonel's office. She stood before his desk at parade rest, her expression unreadable. Jennings studied her for a long moment, a newfound respect in his eyes. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't need to. The file, and the 5 broken men in the infirmary, told him everything. Specialist, he began, his voice devoid of pretense. I've reviewed the reports from this morning's incident. He paused, letting the word hang in the air. It seems we've had you in the wrong job. He gestured to a chair, an invitation to be at ease. I have a sudden opening for a lead instructor in our base-wide Modern Army Combatives program. The position requires someone with a deep, practical understanding of real-world applications. Someone who can teach our soldiers how to not just fight, but how to win. How to survive. He leaned forward, his gaze direct. I think you'd be a perfect fit. It's time we started learning from the best. A flicker of something crossed Vance's face, surprise, relief, perhaps even a hint of a smile. The walls she had built so carefully around herself began to crumble, not from an attack, but from an act of recognition. Of validation. She had been seen, finally, for who she truly was. Thank you, sir, she said, her voice clear and strong. I'd be honored. The following week, Elara Vance stood on the combatives mat again. This time, however, she was not the target. She was the instructor. Before her stood a class of soldiers, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and profound respect. The men who had once snickered at her now watched her every move with rapt attention. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer the quiet clerk. She had found her place, not by demanding respect, but by commanding it through undeniable, irrefutable excellence. She had finished the fight, and in doing so, had finally found her peace. The yard was still dusty, the sun still hot, but for the first time in a long time, Elara Vance felt like she was home.